Political power doesn't usually collapse suddenly. It erodes. This erosion follows predictable patterns that political scientists have documented across centuries and continents. Today, we're examining how executive authority weakens when it encounters institutional resistance, why loyalty-based governance creates inherent instability, and what historical patterns teach us about the limits of presidential power. This is an analysis of political dynamics, not partisan politics. Before we examine specific situations, we need to establish the theoretical framework that political scientists use to analyze executive power. This framework has been developed through decades of research across multiple countries and political systems. Executive power rests on 4 pillars, according to research from scholars at Princeton, Yale, and Harvard. First, institutional authority, the constitutional and legal powers of the office. Second, party loyalty, the willingness of co-partisans to support presidential initiatives. Third, public approval, the perception that the president has a popular mandate. And fourth, elite consensus, agreement among political, business, and media elites that the president's direction is legitimate. When all 4 pillars are strong, presidents can govern effectively even with narrow majorities. But when any pillar weakens significantly, the others cannot fully compensate. And when multiple pillars weaken simultaneously, we see what political scientists call an authority crisis, where the office retains formal power but loses practical ability to implement its agenda. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout American history. Andrew Johnson faced it during Reconstruction, Richard Nixon during Watergate, and more recently, presidents of both parties have experienced versions of this dynamic when their parties controlled Congress, but individual members began breaking ranks on key votes. One of the most misunderstood aspects of American government is how institutional resistance actually functions. Many people think resistance is primarily about dramatic confrontations or public statements, but political science research shows it's actually far more subtle and potentially more effective. The Constitution creates what James Madison called ambition counteracting ambition. Each branch has incentives to protect its own authority against encroachment by the others. This isn't partisan, it's structural. Senators, regardless of party, have institutional reasons to resist executive overreach because it diminishes their own power. Research by political scientists Sarah Binder and Stephen Smith demonstrates that institutional resistance follows predictable patterns. It begins with private concerns raised in party meetings. If those concerns are ignored, it progresses to public questioning, then to procedural obstacles, and finally, if necessary, to direct opposition through votes or investigations. What makes this progression important is that each stage represents an opportunity for course correction. Presidents who recognize early warning signs and adjust their approach can often prevent full institutional rebellion. Those who interpret questioning as disloyalty and double down on contested positions tend to accelerate the breakdown. We saw this with President Obama and Syria intervention in 2013, when congressional resistance forced him to seek authorization he initially believed unnecessary. We saw it with President George W. Bush when Republican senators began publicly questioning Iraq war strategy. And we've seen it in various forms with every modern president when they've pushed institutional boundaries. Now, let's examine what political scientists call the loyalty paradox. Why governance systems based primarily on personal loyalty rather than institutional norms tend to become unstable. Research from comparative politics provides valuable insights here. When leaders prioritize personal loyalty over expertise, competence, or institutional process, they create short-term compliance but long-term fragility, because loyalty without reciprocity breeds resentment, and resentment eventually manifests as resistance. Political scientist Barbara Geddes studied this dynamic extensively in her work on authoritarian regimes. She found that leaders who demand absolute loyalty but provide no guarantee of protection create what she calls defection cascades, where one high-profile break from the leader triggers others who are waiting for permission to distance themselves. In democratic systems, this plays out differently but follows similar logic. Elected officials calculate the costs and benefits of loyalty to any president. As long as loyalty provides political protection, electoral advantage, or policy wins, it persists. But when loyalty begins to carry more costs than benefits, when association becomes liability, rational political actors begin seeking distance. The key insight from this research is that loyalty erosion doesn't require moral courage or principled stands. It only requires self-interest. Once political actors perceive that defending the president hurts their own prospects, institutional dynamics shift rapidly. Let's talk about the practical mathematics of congressional governance, because numbers create incentives that often matter more than ideology or loyalty. When a party controls the House with a margin of 220 to 215, every vote becomes critical. Leadership cannot afford defections on party line votes. This creates immense pressure to maintain unity, but it also gives individual members disproportionate leverage. Research by political scientist Francis Lee shows that narrow majorities fundamentally change legislative behavior. Members from swing districts become more independent because they know leadership needs their votes, and presidents have less room to demand controversial positions because losses become impossible to absorb. This is why presidential approval ratings matter so much during periods of narrow congressional control. When a president's approval drops below 45%, especially in swing districts, members begin calculating whether association helps or hurts their re-election prospects, and electoral survival almost always trumps partisan loyalty. In the Senate, dynamics are different because of the filibuster and because senators serve 6-year terms. This structural difference makes them more willing to resist presidential pressure, especially when they perceive constitutional or institutional concerns.
Throughout American history, we see a consistent pattern. Presidents expand executive authority, Congress pushes back, and courts eventually intervene to clarify boundaries. Let's examine why this cycle repeats and what it reveals about the system. The expansion typically follows a predictable sequence. Presidents invoke emergency powers or national security justifications for actions that stretch constitutional or statutory limits. Initially, Congress may acquiesce, especially during genuine crises, but as time passes and the emergency rationale weakens, institutional resistance builds. Legal scholars have documented this pattern extensively. After 9/11, the Bush administration expanded surveillance and detention authorities based on national security arguments. Initially, Congress provided broad authorization, but as details emerged about specific programs, both Republicans and Democrats began imposing restrictions through legislation and oversight. Similarly, presidents of both parties have used tariff authorities originally granted for narrow trade purposes in increasingly broad ways. Each expansion prompts congressional debate about whether to reassert legislative control over trade policy. This back and forth represents the system functioning as designed, power being checked when it extends too far. What makes these episodes instructive is not partisan, it's institutional. The pattern holds regardless of which party controls the presidency or Congress. When executive actions appear to violate the separation of powers, institutional dynamics eventually force correction, though the timeline can be lengthy. Let's examine the actual mechanics of how presidential authority erodes, because understanding the process helps us recognize it when it occurs. Political scientists identify several key indicators. First, message discipline breaks down. Instead of a unified narrative, the administration cycles through multiple justifications for the same policy. Second, allies begin hedging public statements, offering qualified support rather than full-throated endorsement. Third, procedural resistance increases. Congressional committees slow-walk appointments. Courts grant more preliminary injunctions. State governments assert 10th Amendment authority. Each friction point individually may seem minor, but collectively they signal institutional pushback. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, the gap between announcements and implementation widens. Policies are declared but not executed. Orders are issued but face immediate legal challenge. Threats are made but not followed through. This gap reveals that formal authority no longer translates to practical power. The final stage is when former allies begin creating public distance, not through dramatic breaks, but through careful language, strategic silence, and conspicuous absence from defending controversial positions. This is the point at which authority erosion becomes difficult to reverse, because the coalition that sustained it has fractured. None of this suggests complete collapse. The office of the presidency retains substantial formal authority, but practical governing capacity diminishes significantly. Initiatives stall, ambitious policy becomes impossible, and presidential focus shifts from setting agenda to managing crises. So what does political science teach us about these dynamics of power, loyalty, and institutional resistance? First, that the American system is designed to resist concentrated authority. When any branch pushes boundaries, the others respond. This isn't dysfunction, it's the Constitution working as Madison intended.
Second, that political loyalty is transactional, not eternal. It persists as long as it serves mutual interests. When it stops serving those interests, rational actors adapt. This isn't betrayal, it's politics. Third, that narrow congressional margins create unique instability. Leaders cannot govern through force of personality alone when every vote matters. They must build genuine coalitions through persuasion and compromise. Fourth, that executive authority depends on more than formal powers. It requires party unity, public support, and elite consensus. Lose multiple pillars simultaneously, and governing capacity erodes regardless of who occupies the office. And finally, that these patterns repeat across administrations because they're structural, not personal. Every president tests institutional limits. Every Congress eventually resists. Every court system ultimately intervenes. This cycle is how the system maintains equilibrium over time. Understanding these dynamics doesn't require partisan perspective. It simply requires recognizing how political institutions actually function when tested by ambitious leaders, narrow margins, and competing constitutional interpretations. The patterns we've examined today apply across eras and ideologies. They help us understand not just current events, but how power always works in systems designed to limit it. Democracy doesn't depend on virtuous leaders. It depends on institutions willing to resist when authority overreaches. If you value this kind of analytical, nonpartisan examination of political science principles, subscribe to News Vault. We break down how government actually works using research, historical precedent, and institutional analysis. What other political science concepts should we explore? What historical periods would help illuminate current dynamics? Share your thoughts below. Thanks for watching News Vault, where we examine the forces that shape American politics through the lens of political science. I'll see you in the next one.